Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to November's Animals and Society Colloquium. We'll do introductions in a minute, but first I want to tell you a little bit about the Colloquium series. The Animals and Society Colloquium series is an event that we host each month during the academic year. This will be our last event of this semester, and we will be coming back again in January. Today, I'm going to hand it over to Liz Herkey in a minute to do introductions, but today I just want to let you know some nuts and bolts of how this is going to be run. Our speaker is going to talk, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. During the Q&A, I will monitor the chat, so if you have a question, you could post it up there, or you could just use the raise your hand
Because my
button,
speaker's not working.
and I'll call
No,
some
we
people.
tested it and it works.
Okay, sorry about that. That's a good reminder to everyone. Please stay on mute as well while our speaker is speaking. And I'll be monitoring the chat, and you can feel free to use the chat while you can feel free to use the chat while the talk is going on if you have any comments that you want to make. But we'll keep the microphones off during the talk. So with that, I'll let the event actually get started. By the way, my name is Carol Glasser, and I'm part of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association, and I have the privilege of helping to organize these wonderful events. I'm going to turn it over to Liz Herkey now to give a more proper introduction of the event and of today's speaker.
Well, thank you, Carol, and hello to everyone, and welcome to today's colloquium. Before we jump into our main event, I do want to tell you a little bit about the series in case this is your first time joining us. And I do want to give a big thank you to Carol, because Carol is the one who came up with the idea for the series. And it is a joint project between the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals and Society Institute. Now, if you're a sociologist and you have not already, we hope that you will consider joining ASA and, of course, joining the Animals and Society section. For those of you not familiar with the Animals and Society Institute, ASI is dedicated to furthering the field of human-animal studies as it concerns the complex relationship between humans and other animals. The many programs and activities of ASI include 2 managed academic journals, a book series on human-animal studies, the Defining HAS video series, and loads of resources for scholars, researchers, faculty, and mental health and other professionals. These resources and many more can be found on our website, including a database of HAS-related academic programs. And we'll put links to all of these resources and to our socials in the chat for you. I'd also like to mention today particularly that our HAS program director, Dr. Gala Argent, is leaving her position with ASI. We are very grateful to Gala for all she has done for ASI and the HAS field, and we wish her the very best as she focuses on her research and writing. ASI does plan to continue with the mostly monthly HAS report that was started several years ago by ASI with Dr. Argent. Now, if you're not familiar with the HAS report, it is chock full of information about the field, including ASI and general HAS news, information about conferences, publications, calls for papers, job opportunities, and grant funding. So we encourage everyone, non-academics or academics of any discipline, to sign up for the HAS report. We think it's a valuable resource, and it's also housed on the ASI website. We hope you'll check it out along with all of our other resources. Last but not least, we want to remind everyone that this week is Human-Animal Relationship Awareness Week, also known as #HaraWeek. HaraWeek, which happens during the second week of November, was originally conceived by ASI, but happily has taken on a life of its own. So we encourage everyone to post, tag, like, and share posts featuring photos celebrating the positivity in human, non-human animal relationships. And we'll put links to ASI's #HaraWeek posts in the chat for you to get started. Okay, so on to today's talk. As a reminder, as Carol said, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you prefer to ask your questions that way, please do. And questions will happen at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elisa Aaltola. Dr. Aaltola works as an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Turku, Finland. Her research interests focus on animal philosophy and moral psychology, and she has published widely on both topics. Dr. Altola's books include Animal Suffering, Philosophy and Culture, and Varieties of Empathy, Moral Psychology and Animal Ethics. She's also published a number of volumes in Finnish. Currently, Dr. Altola is leading a research project that focuses on how emotions shape animal-related attitudes. Dr. Altola, thank you so much for being with us today, and I turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the whole society for inviting me to deliver this talk. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. And greetings from Finland. It's quite late here, and my dogs are in the same room, so I hope that they won't try and participate in the conversation. Sometimes they do when I am on a Zoom meeting, but let's see how it goes. My presentation will be on guilt and shame, and I hope that this is now showing to you. Is it showing? Yes?
Yes, it is.
Okay, brilliant. Yes, so without further ado, I will go into the talk because I have quite a few slides to deliver. My main topic is, should animal advocacy avoid causing guilt and shame? And this is a very contested topic, and I hope to explore it through both philosophy and psychology. Oh, I don't know why I'm not moving anywhere. And here are some of my books. I hope that the slide changed for you as well. Did it?
It did. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And here are some of my books, and they were mentioned earlier already, so I won't delve into them anymore. And here is a paper on which this talk is partly based on. So if you want to read more about my ideas on shame and guilt in the environmental and animal context, this might be a good starting point. I'm currently writing a book on this topic, particularly as applied to environmental and animal advocacy. So I'm exploring whether advocates should use these two difficult emotions in order to deliver their message effectively to the general public. And I hope that it will be published next year. So in order to approach the topic, first we need to define what we mean by these emotions. And usually guilt is defined as, first of all, an other-directed emotion. So it's focused on how my actions impact others. It's not self-directed. I'm not concerned with myself, but with the well-being of others. So for instance, a person who eats meat might wonder, how is me eating meat impacting animals? Secondly, guilt is internal. So it happens also when nobody else knows of our indiscretion. So even if nobody knows that we are, for instance, eating meat, which I am not, but somebody might be, guilt can still take place. So it can be completely internal. So even if nobody finds out, I will feel guilty over eating meat. This is something very particular to guilt in comparison to shame. Third, guilt concerns norm violations. So it's focused on morality. It's not focused on amoral issues such as appearance or economic status or any other morally irrelevant issue, but rather it always concerns value or norm violations. It's very normative in this sense. And here an example would be, it is wrong to cause suffering to animals, and therefore eating meat causes a person guilt. And fourth, guilt focuses on individual actions rather than the whole person. So in a state of guilt, we are preoccupied with what a particular action of ours caused to others. And an example would be, I feel bad about eating this steak because this particular action is causing harm to non-human animals. So here are the four often cited characteristics of guilt, and these are so common that I'm not using any citation here because you bump into these in most of the guilt-related research out there. And in guilt, morality is truly central, and this cannot be overstated. And because of this, guilt is often depicted as a morally pedagogic emotion. So there are many authors, psychologists, philosophers, even sociologists, social psychologists, who argue that guilt can be a highly pedagogic emotion. It can teach us about morality. And it can also motivate change in reparatory actions. So empirical studies show that when we feel guilt, we are often motivated to change our actions and also repair the damage that we have caused to others. And in this sense, guilt can be depicted as a highly pro-social emotion. It makes us pay attention to how our actions influence others, and it motivates us to alter and change our actions accordingly. And because of this, it is often valued as a moral emotion. And one argument is that guilt is even necessary for moral development. So without guilt, we simply do not learn morality. We cannot become more ethical in our choices if we never undergo guilt. According to this approach, guilt is like an alarm bell going off when we do something wrong. And without it, we might not notice what is wrong with our actions. So if we don't feel guilt, we are stuck in a sort of egoistic landscape where we are only concerned about our own well-being, and we are not alarmed to the well-being of others. And because of this research, I suggest that guilt tripping can even be a virtue rather than a vice. I know that often guilt tripping is deemed as a very negative thing, but my argument is that if guilt can truly teach us ethics and make us focused on the well-being of others and make us reflect on how our actions influence others, then of course also guilt tripping, i.e. persuading somebody to feel guilt over wrongful actions, can be a good thing, can be beneficial. But I'll return to this later on. And this applies when guilt has a warranted cause, meaning that the harm is actual and the morality of the situation is evident. There are many instances where we can feel guilt for unwarranted causes. There's a lot of literature which shows that some individuals have proneness towards guilt whereby they undergo guilt even when they shouldn't, even when there's no good reason to feel guilt. And because of this, it's good to pay focus on whether the guilt has moral validity. For instance, in the form of our actions causing harm to non-human animals, or whether it's something more subjective and perhaps something based on our proneness to self-criticism. So I'm making quite a radical claim that guilt tripping can be a virtue, and this is a radical claim in the context of contemporary consumeristic cultures, which are very hostile against guilt. We have all learned about the argument that guilt tripping is always a bad thing. We shouldn't make others feel this very unpleasant emotion, and none of us should feel it ourselves. In my native country, Finland, this is quite a common argument also amongst advocates, environmental activists, animal activists, and in the culture in general. There's a very strong tendency to avoid causing guilt and to avoid feeling guilt. And there's even sort of pride taken in resisting guilt in one's everyday life. So this is an interesting dimension of the contemporary era. And I argue that it's partly, or not only partly, it's inherently a part of the consumeristic culture, because consumerism is based on avoiding guilt. We are sold a constant flood of different gadgets and items which are not good for ourselves, no other animals or other human beings or the environment. And this is possible only if we are taught to avoid guilt. Marketing is something that's founded on this constant chronic avoidance of guilt, with the particular exception of guilt tripping in the context of, for instance, greenwashing. So some some companies might try to guide consumers to buy green items through guilt tripping them into noting their own violations of environmental ethical considerations. But in general, consumerism is largely based on avoiding guilt. And I think that there's a clear danger here of consumerism preventing moral cultivation. And this is not only a danger, I think it's an actuality. I think that the consumeristic cultures in which most of us live, they deliberately prevent moral cultivation. They don't want us to stop and pay attention to how our consumer choices are influencing the rest of the planet. And yet, this same ethos of avoiding guilt is evident also in the context of animal ethics. Many advocates, as I said, insist that we should avoid guilt tripping, and many people in the general public insist that references to animal suffering and other such dimensions of animal ethics are unwarranted guilt tripping. And advocates insist that people should not be made to feel guilt. This is an interesting conversation that I have been taking part in Finland. And for instance, Extinction Rebellion of Finland, many members in the organization argue that we should avoid causing guilt at all costs. And I think that this is very problematic. There's a clear danger of preventing moral cultivation and the sort of sounding of the alarm bell, the internal alarm, which makes us notice our own faults and mistakes. And in general, I think that this consumeristic tendency to deny the role of guilt blocks and prevents moral discussion and awareness. And as I said, this is deliberate. It's part of the capitalist society in which we live in. We are trained not to think about moral issues. And it's partly through this sort of avoidance of guilt that this mechanism is able to sustain itself. Now, in order to define shame, I will also offer 4 different characteristics, and you can compare them to the characteristics of guilt. First of all, whereas guilt is other-directed, shame is self-directed, and it focuses on what will happen to me if others judge me. So, for instance, in the case of meat eating, what will happen to me if others judge me over my meat eating? Will I be accepted anymore as part of the in-group? What will happen to my well-being in this instance? So attention is not placed on what happens to animals, but rather on what happens to me. Shame is often also defined as an external emotion for most. So it's preoccupied with what others think of me. So in this instance, what will others think of me if they know that I eat meat? How will they perceive me? How will they judge me? How will they critique me? And there is usually, well, many authors argue that there's usually hardly any internal reflection, and instead we simply follow the external gaze that is directed at us. So we can feel shame even when we think that we have done nothing wrong. Whereas in a state of guilt, we can feel guilt even if nobody else knows of what we have done. And in this sense, these are very oppositional and very antagonistic emotions. Third, shame concerns identity. So we are focused on the sort of personality and identity that we have. So for instance, what kind of a person am I if I eat meat? What does this signify from the perspective of me as a person? So instead of morality, it's concerned with identity. And lastly, it focuses not on individual actions, like guilt does, but rather on the self, or what is called the global self. So it's obsessed with how we as people are seen by others as a whole. So again, to use meat eating as an example, I have completely failed as a person in the eyes of others if I eat meat. Somebody might think, for instance, in an in-group that is filled with vegans. And again, these are quite common definitions of shame. So I would say that these are almost like a textbook definition of shame. And in a state of shame, we momentarily observe ourselves from the perspectives of others. This is a claim that has been presented, for instance, by Jean-Paul Sartre and Dan Zahavi. Sartre uses the example of looking through a keyhole and suddenly noting that oneself is being observed behind one's back. So we think that we have control of the situation, we are observing the world, we are the center of our internal landscapes, we are the subject acting upon the world. And suddenly we become aware of the fact that somebody else is observing us without us having noticed this. And this makes us feel as if we are not subjects anymore, but rather objects. And not only objects in general, but unworthy, failed, inadequate objects. And according to Sartre and Zahavi, this is an elemental part of shame, feeling like an unworthy object in the eyes of others. And because of this, for us social creatures, social animals, shame can be a psychologically tormenting experience. And a lot of the psychological literature on shame focuses on the anguish it can cause an individual. And because it's so tormenting, it often leads to various defenses, such as hiding and avoiding. In a state of shame, when we feel so inadequate and failed, and we feel intense affliction as a result, the almost logical conclusion is to hide and avoid that factor or those people who are causing us to feel shame. And I think that this often happens in relation to animal advocacy. For instance, I don't want to hear about animal suffering is a very common argument. I myself am also an advocate, and I hear this all the time. I participate a lot in the Finnish media and the Finnish public discussions on the treatment of non-human animals. And this is one of the most frequent things I hear. I don't want to know about animal suffering. I don't want to feel this shame. Another typical defense is denial of either the values or facts concerning, in this case, animals. So animals can't have rights, so it's not true that animals suffer are very common examples of denial as a defense against shame. To give a particular example, when there is undercover footage shown of animals suffering in intensive animal agriculture on animal farms, many people say that this is not real, that this footage is artificially created, that it's not true, and animals don't in reality suffer, or that animals can't have the sort of rights that would make causing that sort of suffering morally problematic. Ridicule is a typical defense as well of both the people and the issues causing shame. So you must be crazy, somebody might say, or veganism is a cult, or this is bonkers, this is insane. These are typical sorts of or forms of ridicule. And I would argue that they often happen because shame has first entered the scene. So these sorts of defenses that advocates often face also in the environmental context, environmental advocacy, but also in animal rights advocacy or animal advocacy in general. These defenses can take place because shame already occurred. And they can lead to wholesale denial of the moral problemacy of the situation in a claim such as, I have done nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with fur farming, or there's nothing wrong with cutting down whole forests, so there's nothing wrong with buying this SUV. Denial is a very strong part of shame in the environmental and animal context, as is overcompensation. So upgrading one's virtues, nobody loves animals like I do, can take place, equally as downgrading others. They don't actually care about animals, they just spread lies and want to make money. It's a typical statement often faced by advocates. And this can be part of overcompensation caused by shame. So when you are made to feel as if you are a failed object in the eyes of others, the sometimes logical thing to do is to overcompensate and say that, no, I'm actually perfect and you are the ones who are failed. And this is humanly understandable, but also, of course, quite dangerous from the viewpoint of moral cultivation. And in general, many scholars working on shame argue that it's extremely defensive as an emotion. So here's one quote: shame leads people to defensively protect their self-image from further harm by hiding, avoidance, and withdrawal. And similar sentences are very common in the relevant research literature. Shame and defensiveness walk hand in hand. And in the extreme, defenses can lead to rage and even violence. That violence can be directed towards oneself. Self-harm is one aspect of shame, but also against others. For instance, in what are called honor killings, but which should actually be called shame killings of one's family members. And all of this suggests that shame is not a very productive emotion to instigate in advocacy. And because of this, a common argument is that we should rather focus on guilt and not shame. And I also myself, earlier on, when I wrote my first paper on shame and guilt, I argued that we should avoid shame whilst making use of guilt in given contexts. And the way to do this is by noting the distinction between proscription and prescription. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but I'm sure that you can see the words here and you understand what I mean. Shame is argued to be based on proscription, denial of something, or forbidding something. So, for instance, the statement "do not eat meat" is a form of prescription, which comes with a very negative connotation, and arguably it can lead to shame more likely than guilt. You can see the paper in which this argument is being made. And guilt, on the other hand, is argued by these scholars to be based on prescription. So it's prescribing something, saying that it would be good to do something. It comes with a positive connotation. And in this instance, for instance, the statement "it's a good idea to eat plant-based food" would be a typical example of prescription, which can lead to guilt, but in a productive and constructive sense. And therefore, if we want to avoid causing shame whilst inviting healthy type of guilt in others, then and in ourselves, then it's a good idea to avoid proscription and instead focus on prescription, according to this argument. And there's a very biblical illustration here, because the fall from paradise is perhaps the most culturally well-known example of proscription and shame in Western cultures. God forbid human beings from doing something, but they did it anyway, and as a result, they had to feel deep shame over their actions. However, I don't know what's happening with the slide here, but however, also shame can be morally productive. This is because guilt feeds the desire to do good, but shame can feed and motivate the willingness to be good. So in a state of shame, not everything is lost. Not all of us become utterly defensive and feel deep anxiety over what's happening, but rather shame can motivate also moral change. And this is precisely because shame is a social emotion and it comes with moral power. If we go back to the antiquity, this was the core of Aristotelian ethics, sociality. We need feedback from others in order to become virtuous and moral. Aristotle emphasized this heavily in his ethics. We cannot become moral through internal reflection alone, but rather we need to learn from the feedback and also criticism offered to us by others. And because of this, both Plato and Aristotle and many others in that era argued that shame is in fact a method of learning virtue. So they argued that, for instance, in Plato's Gorgias, that we learn to become virtuous after we undergo shame for morally impermissible actions. And when others judge us and we feel the external pressure and the judgment of others, this motivates us to change. So the desire to be good people or a good person in the eyes of others can be a strong moral incentive to change one's actions. And I think that this part of shame is largely forgotten about in the contemporary era, perhaps because we are so afraid of difficult emotions. Western cultures are very hedonistic today, and there's an obvious inclination to avoid grief and anger and also guilt and shame. All sorts of uncomfortable, difficult emotions are avoided, and instead we are told that we all should be happy all the time and search for things that bring us joy and comfort. And this is dangerous because negative emotions serve a very important moral psychological purpose. They can, of course, be caused by issues that are unwarranted, but at times they are warranted. And then if they are, we should listen to them. And this is something that the ancient philosophers understood. For instance, Plato and Aristotle strongly emphasized that also challenging difficult emotions can be part of one's road to becoming virtuous. And this is a strong moral incentive, as I stated. So therefore, shame can also come with moral reflection. Its focus on identity urges us to focus on our values and worldviews, and this can motivate change. And one argument has been that reflection on and learning from shame is in fact a sign of what Cheshire Calhoun calls moral maturity. So morally mature people are capable of exploring their shame without defensiveness and seeing whether it's something that they agree with, whether it's something that they should learn from, or whether it's something that they should set aside and get rid of. And through this sort of reflection and moral maturity, the painfulness of shame can lessen. And here shame no longer sparks defenses. And elsewhere, I have argued that this is possible partly if the society teaches us how to come to terms with shame. There's worrying evidence of the fact that contemporary parents often teach their children not to ever feel shame or avoid shame and not to deal with shame or explore it. And this can take away from their ability to learn from shame and also to become morally more mature. And I think that animal ethical shame, or what I call animal ethical shame, can be a motivator for moral change. And this should be considered also in animal advocacy and animal studies literature. The potential positive nature of shame as a moral motivator should be considered. I'll quickly try and introduce a few more things. Here we need to distinguish between two varieties of shame, and these are status shame and moral shame. As it comes to status shame, most of the critique directed against shame applies. So status shame can be very moral destructive. It can interrupt social relationships. It can make us withdraw and avoid and recoil in anguish. It can lead to defenses, and it can lead to rage. It can be extremely destructive. And this is because it focuses only on the external, only on what others think of us. It has no moral maturity. It comes with no moral reflection. It's only concerned on what others think of us. And it also concerns amoral issues such as wealth or appearance or skin color or other matters that do not come with moral relevance. And it's based on maturity thinking. So we often feel status shame when the majority thinks that we are less than we should be. And therefore, minorities often feel status shame. It can even be part of growing up as a member of a minority. But moral shame, on the other hand, can be highly morally constructive because it focuses also on internal values and it reflects on ethical issues. So it pays attention to what is right, what should I do in this instance, what is moral, what would a good person do in this situation. And therefore, it concerns moral issues, not only amoral issues, and it's open to also minority thinking. So we can feel moral shame, even if the majority, let's say, the majority eats factory farmed meat, and a minority comes and says that is wrong. We can feel moral shame, even if we are part of the majority, because, well, this depends on whether we undergo internal value reflection, whether we are morally mature enough to consider the moral permissibility of our actions. I'll just have a look at the time. Jennifer Mannion is one who has argued that shame can be a morally productive emotion and that the suddenness of shame forces us to reevaluate ourselves. So here we witness ourselves and our impact on others from afar, and we also witness social norms from afar. And it is the suddenness of shame, the sudden feeling of being the object of another. In that sort of keyhole example, we suddenly become aware of being evaluated by others. This suddenness can sort of push us away from our comfort zone and make us for a moment witness ourselves from afar. And this can, according to Mannion, be morally productive. And I argue that it's also something that can be life-changing in relation to non-human animals. So suddenly noticing the harm we cause to non-human animals from afar, it can be a life-changing event. I know it has been for me, and I think that it's something that is underexplored in current literature. Now, shame concerns self-perception. Shame concerns the abyss and tension between identity and self-perception. So identity is always socially constructed. It's something that we present to others, but self-perception is something that we hold on to in privacy. And in a state of shame, who we think we are no longer aligns with how others perceive us. And it is this tension that then causes the anguish related to shame. And this can stem from a failure to follow one's moral ideas. So when we notice that we actually are not living up to our own standards, this can be a very morally productive moment in one's lives. And I argue that this applies also in the animal ethical context. Am I living according to my animal ethical beliefs is something that can lead to morally productive shame. And here we require also self-compassion, and indeed empathy is often argued to be a part of both guilt and shame if these emotions are to be morally constructive. So we should feel empathy, self-compassion towards also ourselves if we are to come to terms with these emotions. And I think that empathic self-reflection is a core part of morally constructive shame in particular. So coming to terms with not being as perfect as one would want to be requires self-compassion and also compassion towards others, because if we notice that we're all failed creatures, we all are inadequate in many ways, we can learn from shame collectively together, and thereby this very individual emotion can become collective and cultural. And I will quickly also mention how shame is even necessary for moral capability. For instance, Martha Nussbaum and Krista Thomason have maintained that shame manifests our moral ability. And if we have no shame, we are in trouble. And I think that a very important question to wonder in this particular era is, what would a society without any sense of shame look like? What would our leaders look like if they have no shame? What would our cultures and societies look like without shame? And this applies particularly well to how non-human nature and animals are treated. We are living in the era of climate crisis, intense animal agriculture that kills at least 80 billion animals a year and trillions of fish. There's something deeply shameless about all of this. And because of the severity of the situation, I think we have to explore the role of shame, the potential role of shame in reversing this situation and making us become more virtuous in the way that Plato and Aristotle hoped that we would become. So I think that there's a need to face both guilt and shame over what we are doing to non-human animals and non-human nature in general. Because at the moment we are living in a state of shamelessness in relation to how our actions influence other creatures. And this is a grave mistake. So there's something to be learned from guilt and shame. And empirical research, I will end this presentation here. Empirical research on climate guilt and shame is a good place to explore how all of this applies in practice. Rikke Nielsen, whose PhD I just I was the oral examiner of her PhD recently. I was intrigued by and very impressed by her work on what she calls ego guilt and ego shame, and I think that there's something to be learned from here. She argues that climate guilt is felt mostly according to her empirical data, and it's important here that it's empirical data, not just philosophical speculation. According to her, climate guilt is felt mostly by middle-class, environmentally aware people. So it is middle-class, morally aware individuals who are most prone towards feeling guilt in the context of the environment. And although some seek ad hoc reasons for avoiding this emotion, for instance, a typical example is the statement that we need systemic, not individual change. This is an excuse that many resort to when they try and justify why they will not, for instance, stop eating meat. Even if they're looking for ad hoc reasons, they still feel this guilt, or more likely feel this guilt. Whereas climate shame is felt also by those, and particularly by those who are not that concerned over the environment. So an individual can feel climate shame even if they have no concern for climate crisis. And this applies, according to Rikke's data, particularly to lower socioeconomic groups. So lower than middle class economic groups are more prone towards feeling shame, perhaps because they have been taught to feel more shame over their lower status in general. And whether that shame leads to any change depends on whether they have any environmental concern. So if the person in question has at least some amount of moral awareness concerning the climate crisis, they might be persuaded by the shame to change their actions and ways of life. But shame leads to defenses in those who lack such concern and awareness, and who also feel slighted and talked down upon by environmental advocates. And this shows that there's a clear difference between how guilt and shame work, and that it depends on the people in question and also the context and background relevant to the case. And the lesson to be learned is that the moral constructiveness of guilt and shame is contextual and dependent on the background and values of the individual in question. And guilt is most constructive when, first, there is concern for animals. And I'm here applying Rikke's ideas to the animal case. Of course, this has not been studied empirically, so I'm only creating a hypothesis here, but I think that there's good reason to think that the same applies to animal issues. So guilt is most constructive when, first of all, there is concern for animals, and second, ad hoc excuses are addressed. So here, guilt can become a morally constructive emotion if people have concern and if they avoid excuses. And shame is most constructive when it is accompanied by moral concern for animals and elitism is avoided. So speaking down on people is an extremely unconstructive idea. People will feel shame if you speak to them like they are completely unaware of the facts and that they are somehow morally inept. We should always speak to, an advocate should always speak to even the worst wrongdoers in a respectful manner, avoiding elitism. And in this instance, where shame is accompanied by moral concern and elitism is avoided, shame can become morally constructive. And to conclude, I think that animal advocacy and animal studies literature need to recognize that ultimately both guilt and shame can lead to moral growth. However, this depends on the audience in question and their ability for moral maturity and the contextual factors that I just mentioned. But I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll open it up to questions now. We have one hand raised and 2 questions in the chat, and that might be all we have time for. So I'll just go in order that we have here, in the order that things came up. So I will first start with the first online question, then I'll bounce to an audience member. There was actually, why don't I start with Daniel, who's an audience, so I can filter through the online questions a little bit better first. So Daniel, could you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. I very much enjoyed the talk. Thank you for that. My question concerns, I guess, the tension between, let's say that there's an issue where both sides feel like they have the moral imperative, right? Like with maybe the trans issue, at least in the United States, one side feels that they are morally correct to defend society from people who are trans. The other side, and I'm oversimplifying, of course, the other side feels the opposite, that they have a moral imperative to defend people who are trans from society, or at least from those that would harm them. And so I'm wondering, in that case where both sides feel like they have the moral imperative, does that mean that they are both ethically justified in using shame and guilt to make their arguments to the other side in sort of a consequentialist framework? Or are you seeing this more as a deontological, there is sort of one moral that you can, that there's a morality that exists outside of consequentialism?
That's a good question. I think that all moral emotions can be used equally for any purpose. And there's a lot of talk on how empathy, for instance, can be used for nationalist, sexist, racist purposes through inviting us to feel empathy towards particularly those who are most like us. And this is because I have studied and written about empathy more than guilt and shame. This is something that I constantly keep in mind when discussing moral emotions, because even the most morally virtuous emotions that we are at least culturally taught to appreciate as morally constructive, even they can be used for any group, for any purpose. And I think that these emotions are not something that are aligned with only the right kind of morality, whether we approach it in a utilitarian or deontological or virtue ethics or contractual ethics sort of manner. They are all used. Marketing uses all of them. Political groups use all of them. Trump and Musk use all of them. Anger, grief, joy, all sorts of emotions are being used by different parties. And I think that in this instance, shame and guilt are no exception. But of course, when it comes to morality in general, we all think, I strongly agree with Richard Rorty when he claimed that we all think that we are right. That's what morality has to do with. We all think that we are correct in our stance. And that's all that we can do. We must keep on believing if we have justified cause and we can offer rational arguments for our case, that, for instance, environmental diversity is important or animal well-being is important. And then use the emotions that we can to try and make others think about these issues. And so I would differentiate the whether these are universally correct things, or kind of differentiate the issue of moral realism from whether we should use these emotions or not. I think we will use them regardless of what we believe in. And the mistake of environmental and animal advocacy, and I think that many liberal causes, has been the avoidance of difficult emotions.
Thank you. We're low on time, so we're going to do 2 questions, and I'm going to take one from the chat and then I'll go back to the audience. So I'm just going by upvotes, how many people had a thought on each of these questions. So the most popular question seems to be, I'm going to read it word for word because it's quite a bit. Sentiment on the right in the United States has lately come out against so-called wokeism and education, insisting that nobody should be exposed to learn critical histories of slavery and genocide, as it might stir up bad emotions in them. Things like guilt, shame, anxiety, lower self-esteem, etc. Might you have any remarks on the intersectionality of moral psychology? For example, the interface between animal advocacy and race relations vis-a-vis their effective dynamism.
That's a really important question, and there's empirical evidence to show that different suppressed minorities are more prone towards feeling both guilt and shame. A typical example is a Holocaust survivor who felt both of these emotions to a point of committing suicide as a result. Women, people with different ethnicity than Caucasian individuals, the poor, lots of different disabled people, lots of different groups who are marginalized are likely more prone towards feeling these emotions. And that's something that needs to be tackled in environmental and animal advocacy. And I think that one way to do this is to emphasize the moral dimension of these emotions. So these are not about your status in the society, but rather what you do as a person in your life choices. And yeah, and I think that that needs to be constantly highlighted, so that this is not about who is a good or adequate person in general, but rather who in their deeds and their actions is being respectful towards also the environment and animals. But it's a difficult question, and I have written about trauma and PTSD and its proneness towards feeling, or the way that it makes individuals prone towards feeling shame and guilt. And of course, this then places individuals with marginalization and also difficult life experiences in a more vulnerable position. So it's an important question.
Thank you. And then we'll go to Laura Donna for our last question today.
Hi, Elisa. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. I am a postdoc at the University of Miami, and I work on animal agriculture and climate change. So my question is kind of comes out of trying to figure something out. So have you thought about how the animal exploitation industry, for example, have seized on the concept of guilt by, by creating marketing and advertising strategies that attempt to use guilt, to make people change their purchasing behavior. So, for example, humanely so-called humane meat and greenwashed products and so on. So those kind of work on addressing guilt in people. Have you thought of that, and if you have anything to say about that? Thank you so much
Yes.
again. It was a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. That's another important question. And Sarah Fredericks, who's written a book on environmental guilt and shame, which came out recently, she tackles this issue of marketing and the way that fossil companies and other such instances can use greenwashing, can use guilt in their efforts to greenwash their products. And therefore, we are made to feel guilty if we don't get the non-plastic straw or the recyclable bag or something like that, which in the end has very little significance from the viewpoint of the environment. And this is, I think my answer is that this is an instance of guilt and shame being used against environmental and animal efforts. And therefore, we need to use similar moral pedagogy or similar methods in order to combat this and in order to challenge this sort of usage of guilt. So the other party is scrupulous. They use any means that they can. And I think that there's been a certain type of gentleness and niceness about environmental and animal advocacy and many other forms of advocacy in trying to avoid these difficult emotions. And it comes with a cost of not being effective. So I don't know if I sound too, yeah. I think that we should use all moral psychological methods that we can, because the situation is so dire. The climate crisis, use of animals, animal suffering, nature loss, these situations are so acute and dire that we need to do all that we can to prevent them. In a different era, I think that we could say that, okay, don't ever make other people feel shame. But in this era, I think that we need more methods.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, and it obviously got all of us thinking quite a bit. We're at the end of the hour, so we're going to have to conclude today. I do follow up every talk with an email when the recording of the event is ready. There's some questions in the chat about whether or not the presentation slides will be available, bibliography will be available. I'll follow up with Dr. Alatola to see if those will be available, and I'll let you know in that email if they are. Thank you so much, Dr. Alatola. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we leave today?
So apologies for my clumsy English. It's difficult for me to pronounce English anymore after I have relocated back to Finland, and we have a very different way of producing language. But I hope that you understood something from what I was saying, and at least the slides were there. And I think that this is such an important topic that I feel that it deserves to be explored through different viewpoints in scholarly work in the future, as do all moral emotions. And I was meant to say something about joy and empathy as well. And if I had had more time, I would have done that. What we need in the end is also relief. And I think that ultimately love, in a moral sense of the term, moral love is something that can entwine with morally productive guilt and shame. And that's a claim of my upcoming book. And so there's a positive tone in the end. Even if these are gloomy emotions, there's always hope in the end. And I think that this is something we all need to remember, but particularly those of you living in America today.
Thank you so much. And thanks for ending that on a positive note. I really look forward to that book. Your English is impeccable, so please don't worry about that. And thank you. I think this is a perfect presentation for the Human and Animal Relationships Awareness Week. to get those of us who care so much about this issue really thinking about where our messaging fits and how to do a better job of communicating with others. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We will be back in January with another colloquium. We'll be sending an email about that out. So all of you, by whichever channels you heard about this talk, we'll be hearing about that talk probably in mid-December. We'll be sending out some announcements about that. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again in January, I hope. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.